Hello ladies and gentlemen, in today's video I want to talk about power creep. I feel like this is a very good time to touch on this topic. We're in a new version, however not only that, we also have the current 4.2 beta in which we are able to see the first real dedicated main DPSs that this version has to offer. And one question that is always brought up, I feel like every single version that always fails, is will the new team from a version power creep the older version flagship? Now, this is especially a bigger topic than ever before, because even if there have been behemoths of power flagship DPSs slash teams from a version, there have never been any as powerful and as synergistic as Mono Rem, right? So that's why it's really such a popular topic currently. People think it's impossible to power creep Mono Rem, and especially because of not only how synergistic their base kits are, but also their Eidolons being able to universally help the team for the most part. However, I am of the belief that it does not matter how synergistic you think a team is. It does not matter how, peak power that they have. It just doesn't matter, right? This game will always go out of their way to power creep them, whether you believe it or not. And in fact, in this same beta, this shit is basically happening right now, right? For those who don't know, Evanesia, I believe, is the current best low-cost clearing main DPS for all endgame content in this game. Well, actually, I won't say all, maybe not like APOC and Pure Fiction. However, for AA and MOC, I do believe that her, Nova Firefly, and Nova Seal are basically all going band for band against the majority of the bosses, right? And keep in mind, they are doing like significantly better in comparison to Mono Rem. Here's the thing, Mono Rem is like vastly overrated in this community. A lot of people think it's like this untouchable team that no one can compare to. However, the reality is, unless you are a whale, putting like whale levels of investment into a team, Evernight Hypercarry is already stronger than Mono Rem, right? So Evernight Hypercarry basically has better clears at like 8 or less cost across, I believe, all endgame content, not like just MOC or just AA, literally everything. And it's not until you get like 10 plus cost range where finally Cassie Mono Rem starts being a very good option. However, the thing is, even now, in this 10 plus cost range, I believe Mono Rem isn't untouchable anymore. Nova Seal, Nova Firefly, and as well as Evanesia are all really showing out against the endgame content currently. And this is considering that Evanesia is the one who's like least synergistic in comparison to Silverwolf in terms of having Elation teammates on her team. On top of this, this Elation team isn't finished. And on top of this, her vertical investment is very sad outside of her E1, right? Meanwhile, you have these Mono Rem teams who have absolutely perfect synergy, perfectly synergistic Eidolons, perfectly synergistic light cones, literally made to tackle the endgame content and be the strongest, yet somehow one of the first dedicated main DPSs from a new version, despite how many flaws they seem to have, simply seems to be as strong despite all of that. And this is proof that no matter what, this game will go out of their way to power creep older teams and older characters, despite how perfect or strong you may think a certain team is. So this entire recurring cycle, recurring question of, is it possible to power creep Mono Rem? Is it possible to power creep Acheron? Is it possible to power creep Firefly and Fei Xiao? In V1, it was, is it possible to power creep Jingliu and Dill? The answer is always yes, and you should always be confident in the fact that this game will find a way to fuck over older teams and DPSs in order to favor the newer ones, right? No matter what. Now, does this mean that older DPSs and teams are completely bricked from clearing endgame content? The context depends. HSR has one of the most doomer communities, if not the most, I've ever seen in a gacha space. Now, I'm not going to say that this is necessarily the worst thing in the world. In fact, I think it's better to have a community who's more critical, especially in gacha games, as compared to one that is stupidly toxically positive, like my experience with the Lua community. However, sometimes it does go too far. Many of you would already know examples of this, of like characters are useless after 2 patches, said character literally does not work without having certain teammates. Things like this are huge. Oh my god, voice crack. Things like this are usually vastly over exaggerated because people just don't want to actually tell the truth about this game. I don't know why, but it just is a thing people do for agenda, right? There are many DPSs in this game who can function pretty well with some of the generalist supports who don't really have a home. And there are many examples of this, like Phanon, right? People talk about Phanon in one of these examples of characters who have a dedicated support like Saridra. However, believe it or not, Phanon doesn't actually really need Saridra at all. Her value is really overestimated, and he mainly only really cares about his E2. In my opinion, Phanon is probably the only character in the game where it genuinely makes sense to call him an E2 merchant, because it just fixes way too many of his issues, and it especially fixes, for the most part, his pure fiction and APOC performance. A lot of people only look at MOC performance and think Phanon is like the most impressive DPS in the game, or one of them. However, the second you look at his E0 pure fiction and APOC performance, it is some of the most embarrassing shit of all time without his E2 to help him get those extra turns, right? So, with that being said, there are ways to combat the newer version's power creep and HP inflation even while using older teams. Now, is it optimal to continue investing in older teams despite new version meta coming around? No. The answer is almost always going to be no. Every single time, it's better to invest into newer teams because they are just vastly stronger as compared to the previous versions, even if they don't have fully synergistic teammates, they aren't getting fully shielded. You guys should have already learned this from the difference between V1 and V2, and then the difference from V2 to V3, and then now with the current beta of Evanescia with scuffed ass teams and vertical investment being able to still stand on top in comparison to all other V3 DPSs at clearing things like MOC and AA. Right? Shit like this is always going to happen. However, you can do an optimal investment. You can keep investing in some older teams. And so long as you aren't doing this shit completely blindly and you have like no clue what you're doing, if you have some clue of good investments that could help your team a little bit, you don't even need to get dedicated supports for some of these DPSs, just general ones that can actually synergize with them to some extent. You will be able to clear endgame content in this game despite not doing the most meta decisions, right? I have a free-to-play account, and this account has made one of the dumbest decisions possible, which is getting E6 on Anoxa. Anoxa has some of the worst Eidolon investment for a main DPS in the entirety of Amphoreus. On top of this, he is the character who most highly values horizontal investment in the entirety of Amphoreus. So me going into his E6 without getting Cyrene is dumb. Cyrene is way more valuable than getting all the way up to this guy's E6, right? So let's imagine I had an E0 Anoxa, and then I used the 6 cost from these Eidolons and just magically removed it. Then I could put one cost into Cyrene, and I'd have a E1 Ceredra Anoxa team with Cyrene and Donhung PT, which would be way, way stronger as compared to using it with just Sunday. However, not only this, I'd have 5 costs left, and I could put this 5 cost into an entirely new team. For example, if I didn't go for E6 Anoxa and I saved all these pulls that I put into his copies for a V4 team, if I did like optimal investment, let's say, it would look something like E1 S1 Evanesia, RMC or slash EMC, Yao Guang slash E1 Yao Guang, and then buffed Huo. Now keep in mind, Huo should be free on the anniversary. They're adding her to the golden token shop, and they always give golden tokens on an anniversary, so she doesn't actually cost anything here, right? That is a completely new third team that would absolutely demolish all endgame content I put it against, and I wouldn't have to worry about AA for a very, very long time to come. That's what optimal investment actually kind of looks like. However, I'm just not doing that because clearly I went for an E6 Anoxa. I don't know who I'm going to pull as a third DPS on this account anymore. I'm truly like a little bit clueless. However, we'll of course see how that goes. For now though, I still need to prioritize getting Cyrene for sure. Then I'll decide what the fuck I do with my E1 Tribby and Sunday, which are kind of just sitting ducks on this account. However, for example, I'll show you guys clears on this free-to-play account that I've gotten so far. As you can see, I'm full clearing everything and doing decent against AA. The reason I can't get to King in AA is because I don't have a third DPS on this team from vertically investing in Anoxa so much, right? But as you can see, if we go over here, I still have like a shit ton of AV left, right here. I have like 700 AV left for APOC. MOC, I believe, took me like 3 cycles with my Archer and Anoxa team. Pure Fiction is obviously where I struggle the most, having Anoxa and Archer as my main DPSs. However, even there, I'm still able to get like 70 to 80k clears, and I will probably continue to be able to do that for quite a good while going into the future. I mean, I'm just not struggling, and I'm not going to struggle for probably the next half year to a year, despite the fact that I did an optimal investment into Anoxa's Eidolons. So this account, right, is living proof that even if you do unoptimal investment, so long as it isn't literally random bullshit go pulls, you'll still be able to clear endgame content incredibly consistently. The problem arises in which you play this game very on and off. You maybe take breaks for weeks or months on end consistently, so obviously your pull income is significantly less over time. If you are a player like this, by the way, I used to be this player, it is way, way more difficult to keep up with this game's HP inflation and power creep. That is where the problem arises. However, even as a free-to-play, so long as you play this game incredibly consistently, you will always be able to clear endgame content in this game, even without optimal polling, right? It shouldn't be too much of an issue. So that's my thoughts on like power creep in HSR. I think the recurring question of is new version team slash DPS going to be stronger than previous version flagship is kind of dumb, and it's basically inevitable. I don't really understand why this topic is always so popular, and despite the fact that this game has massive levels of HP inflation and power creep, I do sincerely believe that even as a free-to-play, it's very easily tackleable so long as you aren't completely clueless and you play the game consistently. Feel free to disagree. Let me know your opinions down in the comments. Hope you all have a great day. Hope you all have a great night, and peace out.